In my opinion, the place where I think the tech world could have a huge impact is everything to do with commercialization of a drug. Because if you think about it, the tech community knows how to connect with customers. Biotech companies don't know how to do that. Pharma kind of does, but they spend a lot of money to do it. So could that be an area where tech really brings a lot to the table? I think so, for sure.
This is Second Opinion. I'm Christina Farr.
I'm Zenooz. And I'm Luba Greenwood.
Welcome to the pod, where each week we navigate what's really going on in healthcare through strikingly candid conversations with the entrepreneurs and investors leading the charge. As your co-hosts, we promise to bring the perspective of a former journalist and investor, a doctor, a lawyer, immersed in the future of medicine with life sciences and digital health.
And we're here to set the signal from the noise in all of these conversations. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Make sure you stick around at the end of the interview for our debrief. Welcome. Today we have Daphne Zohar with us, who is a CEO of Seaport Therapeutics. Thank you so much for coming on our podcast, Daphne.
Thanks so much for having me.
On this podcast, we talk about everything in healthcare. We cover the whole continuum of healthcare, everything from digital health to the regulatory aspects, financial investment aspects, and medical, of course, and most importantly, patients. So you are our guru on biotech and therapeutics, and not just that, but also on investment in this space and entrepreneurship and running companies. I do want to just give a little bit of your background, which is quite impressive. You started the first company at 16. We have a lot of entrepreneurs on this show, but not everybody has started a, fully fledged company at such a young age. You then went on and built many companies, including most recently have been a CEO and a founder of PureTech, which is a publicly traded company, and have done such a fantastic job where you built not just the company, but also within the companies, you built fantastic enterprises such as Karuna, which we'll talk about later. And most recently now you're running Seaport Therapeutics, where you just raised $100 million for Series A, which is an impressive raise. We often do raise a lot of money in biotech, but this is in itself impressive. What's interesting, and I would love to kick this off with just a discussion of the therapeutic area that you're in. Seaport Therapeutics, and also the company that you also built and sold, Karuna, is in the mental health and the neuro space. And mental health is a space similar to obesity, where there wasn't that much investment, where there wasn't as much interest, not just from investors, but also from pharmaceutical companies in putting money in or investing or buying or partnering with companies in obesity or mental health. And of course, that has changed very recently, as we've seen with Ozempic and others, with Novo and Eli Lilly, but certainly in mental health. So I would love to get your opinion on why this happened, and how do you see the future of mental health and investing in building companies in that space?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to draw the parallel between obesity and mental health disorders like anxiety and depression. So if you think about it, Ozempic, everybody at their dinner table is talking about it, and it's something that can affect so many people. I think mental health disorders like anxiety and depression have a lot of similarities to that, because almost everyone knows somebody who's affected by it, right? So if you think about it, there's 320 million people in the world that have anxiety and depression, and the overlap between the two is about 120 million. It's one of the top 5 causes of death in adolescence. So suicide is one of the leading causes of death in adolescence. There's a rising amount of suicidality, and I think a lot of that has been driven by, in addition to things like the pandemic, social media, and other impacts to, for example, adolescence. I personally am talking about adolescence because I'm personally connected to this. I have a 15-year-old daughter who has depression, and my mother has anxious depression. So I personally care about this space quite a lot. And I think that there's been some skepticism in the past about developing new drugs for psychiatric disorders. The reason is that it's kind of hard to do it. So the success rate in the clinic is very low. And what we've been thinking about is, could you take advantage of drugs that have gotten to a certain point in development and showed some really interesting efficacy or activity, but then were held back by a liability that we can now solve with today's technology. So that's the approach that we're taking, and I think that it offers a lot of potential. And I personally am very enthusiastic about it. And I think one of the things that's interesting about neuropsychiatric disorders is the need is so great that even drugs that have limited efficacy, so modest effect sizes, where a third of patients don't respond, where they don't have activity for weeks, like the SSRIs and the SNRIs, even those drugs, there's multiple blockbuster drugs in that category. So very big need, both, I think, from a public health perspective, but also commercially.
Definitely, that's so interesting. I think, if you take a step back, you're talking about drugs that are already on market that you can look at, new ways to use it. But can you take a step back and help us understand the typical journey of a drug from concept to market approval? What are some challenges that typical entrepreneurs face in this space during this drug development process to even get to that first market approval?
Yeah, it's a great point because the biotech industry, I think, is really misunderstood. People think about these big pharma guys sitting in Congress and, they're they're keeping their drugs on the market through all kinds of, patent extension strategies, and they seem to be hiking up the price of drugs. And so there's a perception of the industry that's quite different than what we do as biotech entrepreneurs. So I started, for example, PureTech with a $100,000 check from an angel investor. This was the company I started before Seaport. And, these to take a drug and advance it. So you hear about a breakthrough that's published in a major journal and everybody talks about it. A lot of those new breakthroughs never get developed. They sit in what we call the valley of death between academia and the clinic and clinical development. So really there's an initial breakthrough which I think creates a lot of excitement, but it's usually based on basic research. And then there's what's called as translational research, where you have to take that breakthrough and develop it into a new medicine that can actually be tested in patients. So that's drug discovery and preclinical development. That could take 3 to 7 years to get a drug from breakthrough drug discovery through preclinical development to the point where you're actually testing it in patients. And the funding for that stage of development is really hard to come by. So there's a lot of investors on the other side of the valley of death. Once you've shown some initial preclinical or clinical proof of concept, then everybody wants to come in and fund it. But before that, it's really hard to get funding. And I think of us entrepreneurs almost like Sherpas helping to cross the valley of death. And once you have an experienced Sherpa, everybody wants to give them money. But like in the beginning, you have to kind of learn how to do this with other experts. So you take it into clinical development. There's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then potentially FDA approval. The success rate of most drugs is in the single digit percentages once you get through preclinical development. And in the area of neuropsychiatry, for example, and oncology, those are some of the hardest success rates. So just going back to what I said earlier, what I was actually saying was that we're not taking drugs that are already approved. We're taking drugs that like the industry spent all this time and money on. They got it to the point of human testing, saw that it worked in people, but then like it caused some side effects. And I can give you an example of a drug that exactly fit that criteria, which is the KarXT program that we developed at Karuna. So you have GI side effects or some other issue, and the drug company doesn't develop it. So it's just sitting on a shelf and it's not getting developed. And actually, KarXT, which I think has the potential to be the first new treatment for schizophrenia in something like 60 years, was one of those examples. And it was sort of in that valley of death.
Yeah, and I do want to commend you on this creativity of doing this, because unlike in oncology, as you know, which is as you said, yes, it's very difficult, but on the easier side is we have some good models for translation. So if you see something in vitro, you can predict, even sometimes using machine learning, predict that is going to work in vivo and most likely going to work in a human. And we have models, that mice models, animal models, that translate into humans eventually. And in neuro, it is so difficult because in neuro, it's hard to predict. The good thing is that our brains are not mice brains. And so I think this is a fantastic way that you have thought of. And, you and other companies are doing that, although not that many, because you do have to have an understanding of the mechanism of action of many, many different drugs and what has worked and what hasn't, and develop fantastic chemistry to match that biology so that it does work eventually and that you do get rid of some of the tolerance and other risks.
Yeah, and there's certain areas, as you know, Luba, like antibiotic drug development, where the translation between animal and human is much better than in areas like oncology or neuropsychiatry.
Absolutely.
Daphne, what do you think, just going back to some of the aspects of fundraising, because you've talked about the valley of death and, the before and the after once you have some proof and how much easier it becomes for obvious reasons once you've got that proof. What do you think about all these new VCs that have no biotech background that really are from technology firms coming into biotech? Do you think that it's just dumb money, or is it going to be helpful for more creative biotech founders like you, or those that, are really looking to raise money before they've got any evidence that what they're doing works? Like, do we need this kind of money, or should these folks just be saying, you know what, I'm going to stay in my lane because I don't have a clue what I'm talking about. I don't know what, half the terms you just said even mean. And it's funny. I think about a firm like Founders Fund that started doing biotech out of nowhere, and I believe StemCentrx was one of their companies. And you could argue that that's not a successful business in the long run. I'm sure Luba has opinions about it, but it was a very good exit for them, and they didn't know very much about biotech at all. So what does that say about these new tech VCs?
Yeah, I think StemCentrx from a VC perspective was a huge win because I think it was like $5 or $6 billion acquisition. But as you point out, the drug later failed. And so that has blowback. Of course, when a drug company buys a drug and it later fails, it does affect their appetite for M&A. And M&A drives the sector. So these, biotech investors, really the way they make money is when one of the companies that they've invested in gets acquired by a large pharma company. In terms of your question about tech versus biotech, there's this, it's interesting because the tech guys who are interested in biotech, and some of them are really smart, like Andreessen Horowitz, Google Ventures. I mean, they bring around them really sophisticated and experienced drug developers, and then they try to improve on things, whether it be applying AI to drug discovery, or in my opinion, the place where I think the tech world could have a huge impact is everything to do with commercialization of a drug.
Mhm.
Because if you think about it, the tech community knows how to connect with customers. Biotech companies don't know how to do that. Pharma kind of does, but they spend a lot of money to do it. So could that be an area where tech really brings a lot to the table? I think so, for sure. I do think that there tends to be a little bit of, new people that come to any sector. They sort of don't realize how hard it is sometimes. So like, tech's going to eat, biotech or whatever. They come up with phrases, like the brain is, like a computer and we're going to program it. And I think that one of the things about our sector is it just really, really hard. And people who have been doing this for 30, 40 years get surprised, get disappointing outcomes. And so I think a nice level of humility and being willing to connect, I think some of these tech investors could make a huge impact.
And Luba, I want to know what you think, because you worked for one of these companies. You were at, Verily, which I know doesn't like to say it's part of Google, but it's the same idea. So what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with Daphne. I do think that many investors, such as like Google Ventures and others, do have sophisticated drug developers, as Daphne has mentioned, and they also have a lot of knowledge and appetite for risk, truthfully, and more appetite for risk sometimes than the biotech investors. They're also, on the one hand, biotech investors have a lot more, I would say, humility, and they patience to wait, for example, for some, let's say that if you have some preclinical results that are not the best, or even clinical not the best, there is, I would say, not an urgency then to deliver a quick result right away. But on the other hand, I have to say that tech investors sometimes appreciate platform technologies much more. They have the appetite to wait for the platform to develop before you go in and start your asset development. And a lot of biotech investors, and this is where a lot of the disconnect happens, even when you have a platform such as, let's say, chemoproteomics platform, so not a machine learning platform, but a platform based on novel biology or novel chemistry, novel approaches to drug discovery or screening of molecules. You will see many times it's the tech investors that are not pushing the companies to go and start their programs and getting drugs into the clinic. A lot of the times they do allow for the company to work for 2, 3 years and build out the strengths and build out the novel data, because novel data at the end, a lot of tech investors realize and know is where the money eventually and the learnings and insights are. So I think there's definitely room for both. I think that the part where I'm a little worried, and I would love Daphne's thoughts on, is about the regulators, because ultimately, regardless of who invests, Daphne, you mentioned M&A, IPO and M&A is really the way that you exit. And M&A is probably the best way, I would say, to exit for a biotech company, and it's best for patients as well, because you are very quickly partnering with a big pharma partner who has the capabilities, and you're not building redundancy such as a commercial infrastructure internally. You're not leveraging and building out your own regulatory pipeline. You are leveraging that from the big pharma company, which is kind of, at the end of the day, is a cost saving. But we see regulatory authorities, FTC and others, are challenging that. So I'd love to just get a sense from you, Daphne. What are your thoughts on that? And is that a real threat, potentially, a lot of these regulatory headwinds for biotech?
Definitely. So I think, we talked earlier about the reputation of the industry and how it's misunderstood. And what that leads to is legislation that gets in the way of new drugs getting developed. So, we've seen these types of regulatory headwinds. For example, the FTC under Lena Khan has been very aggressive in pushing back on M&A transactions. Now, they have not been successful. So they've had almost like a zero, success rate. Their one success was Grail, which was really driven by the European regulatory authorities. And then they had this like small rare disease company that was developing a new treatment for Pompe disease. It's a horrible rare disease, and they pushed back on that. And then Sanofi walked away from it. But those were their two successes. So they've not been very successful, but it creates sort of a weight on the sector, because once a company IPOs, even the investors that are investing in biotech companies are looking for that company to get acquired for billions of dollars. So the best success story is a company that, goes public and then gets acquired for like 10x or 20x what the IPO price was.
Can you give an
Yeah.
example of a successful M&A in the space?
I mean, I can give one example that I was involved with, but I think that the kind of why is that one a good one? It's because there was a lot of investors that made money, and when a lot of investors make money, that money gets recycled back into the earlier stage companies, right? So that I think that's the biggest success story, is when you can make money for everybody along the way and then recycle. And the company that Luba was touching on earlier, this is Karuna Therapeutics, was just acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb for $14 billion, right? So we started that, we invented the program, but we started it, and we obviously made money as we were developing it. But the investors that came in at the IPO, it was up 3,000% from the IPO price. So all of those investors made money. And then everyone who got paid out is now takes that money and plows it back into the sector. And I think we saw in December, for example, a number of M&A transactions, including Karuna, Cerevel, and a few others, and the sector got really, kind of frothy again, and IPOs started to happen. So that's one piece of it. The other way that it recycles, important resources is it recycles talent. So the people who are running those companies then go off and start new companies. They enter the venture world. So all of that I think is very positive. FTC and some legislators think that what happens is a big company comes and buys this little company, and then they take all the innovation out. But the truth is, biotech companies don't know how to commercialize drugs. So you need the pharma companies to come at that point. It's very similar to like the movie industry, right? There's the big distributors. There's the independent producers and directors. You can't have a successful biotech drug. You can't have a successful movie without those big guys at the end. But the little guys are the ones who are getting hurt by these new laws. So If M&A gets, pushed back on by FTC, then there'll be less investment in earlier stage companies. Or, we saw another, if we're talking about regulatory, the IRA has this has some drug pricing legislation, which has been a weight on the sector because what it does is it shortens the patent life. Shortens the life of commercial drugs. So once they get to a certain point of sales, they then have to negotiate with the government, and the price is capped at that point. What does that mean for small companies? It just means that when pharma companies look to acquire, when investors look to invest, they do an analysis which makes it much harder for early stage entrepreneurs to raise money from investors.
Yeah, and can I also just give an example of, I think, the disconnect that Daphne you're also talking about? I think that sometimes us in the industry, either entrepreneurs or investors or company builders, or even being on the pharma side and the buy side pharma, it is very obvious to us that how the process works. You start out, Daphne, as you laid it out very, very well for the audience, for us, for the listeners. You start out with something in academia that is usually very, very early. We're talking sometimes it's just not even just basic research a lot of the times, and then it gets into translational research. Then we get into in vitro and in vivo testing. There's usually about 3-4 years before, sometimes 5 years before it gets into the clinic, meaning that we are giving something for patients. And initially, of course, we start with safety because it's important to test out safety. So, and then we go into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And that process takes a long time. And the whole process is about sometimes 10 to 15 years, depending on the technology, depending on the therapeutic area. And usually, sadly, for the therapeutic areas and modalities that are the cheapest, so such as small molecules, and modalities that and also the therapeutic areas that have the highest unmet medical needs, such as mental health, you have to, or Alzheimer's or other neurodevelopmental diseases, you have to enroll hundreds and hundreds of patients, and it takes time just to even enroll patients. And you have to, and only after that, when you're showing that this is something that works and really benefits patients, you can then have it on the market. So again, we're talking about 15 years, and you're given a patent for 20 years. So you have 5 years left, and then you have to launch it. And usually, even when you launch a drug, you have to convince physicians to prescribe this drug. So just because you launch a drug, people don't realize it's not immediately sold for $20 billion as an aggregate per year. It takes usually 5 years. So by the time you get to the point where you are selling your drug and it's something that is prescribed and patients are benefiting, you're done with your patent. But if you're thinking about the 15-year average run that it takes, I think it's really hard for people to truly understand. And I'll give you an example of this. I had a healthcare economist come into one of my companies, one of my biotech companies, and I explained exactly what I just said to all of you of just what we're doing. And we have a big lab. I took the economist through the lab, showed what we're doing, was very excited that we're finally in mice. And after about an hour of a tour, the healthcare economist said, well, this is all great, but where is the manufacturing for the patients? I was a bit shocked because it does show a bit of a lack of understanding that she's asking you the question of something that's going to happen in 15 years, that you're going to be manufacturing this for patients in so long. So I don't know, Daphne, I know that you are on the board of Bio organization, and you advocate a lot for the industry, and you work really closely with regulatory authorities. Are you seeing the same? Do you see that there is hope for, to basically go against some of these regulatory challenges?
I think that is the more they learn and understand about the industry, the better. So you talked about the 15 years, and how does that affect drug pricing? Like, what does that mean? Like, why do drug companies have to make a certain amount of money? Well, because they have a huge failure rate, right? So if one of 10 drugs actually makes it all the way through, that's billions of dollars to get to the point where something actually works. And investors, when they go and they do their NPV analysis on a new startup that's trying to cross the valley of death, they have to believe that there's going to be that upside potential on the other side. Otherwise, they won't make the investment, right? So that's one part of it. The other part of it, which I think is an educational piece of it, and Ash, I know you know this space really well, is the whole concept of what do these middlemen do, right? So people think that the price of the drug is all going to the pharma company. They don't realize that there's rebates and discounts and things like that that aren't passed on to patients. And I think, in my work at Bio, one of the goals that we've been talking about, which would be an amazing goal, would be to eliminate out of pocket costs for consumers, for patients. Because if you think about it, that's really the problem is the out of pocket costs for patients. But that's not being driven by biotech companies developing new drugs. In fact, if you think about it, a new drug after, a certain number of years is going to go generic and it's going to be really cheap and it's going to be available to all patients. If you look at a procedure like surgery, that never goes generic. And the prices of hospital procedures just keep going up and up. So, trying to understand this space, it's really complicated. And when you get almost like bull in the china shop type of legislators who like the sound bite and think that big pharma is, the bad guy, they're going to make legislation that is actually going to stop us from developing new medicines for our, family members, for, our children, our grandchildren, our parents. All of that is going to be the result of legislation that basically relegates more drugs to this valley of death.
Daphne, this has been so interesting. Just curious, we've been hearing a lot about the Biosecure Act. I feel like the industry is maybe happy with some of this, and maybe there's some cautious optimism around this. And then we're also hearing some concerns. Can you quickly talk to us about what this is and the impact of the industry, and what is the impact of further innovation or supply chain in the space?
Yeah, so basically it's part of a broader effort to protect national security. And you see it with TikTok, for example. And the idea is that there's companies that have ownership from the Chinese government and they have access to data from patients. They're developing new medicines. They have the potential to, if this were in the wrong hands and used in a bad way, could be a national security threat. So the Biosecure Act is basically trying to disentangle the US biotech industry from companies in China primarily that are affiliated with the Chinese government. Some of the concerns around this is that there's very well respected companies like WuXi, that are developing many companies are working with that are manufacturing important drugs for patients. So one initial concern was that this decoupling would happen too quickly and it would be a big problem. They've now extended that time period by 8 years, actually, due to some work from Bio. But in general, I think there's definitely mixed feelings about this. I wouldn't say that it's 100% supported by everyone in the industry.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks for kicking off the biotech portion of this podcast. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
We'd love to have you back.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. It's so much fun. And we'll all have to get a drink sometime and continue this conversation.
Well, that was a great conversation with Daphne. I'm glad that she was able to stop by and give us the latest and greatest updates on biotech. Gosh, it is really challenging. I love, Chrissy, that you asked her about the biotech investor perspective versus the tech investor perspective. I mean, what do you think? Do you think we should have more tech investors, especially now that biotech is picking up, getting in, and more generalist investors as well? We are seeing some as they're getting in, but what do you think?
I wonder a lot actually about the kind of the tweener companies, the ones that are not quite biotech and not quite digital health. There are a lot of those. They've got some level of FDA risk, but it's a very, very low risk. It's some of these kind of AI type companies, software companies that are doing some sort of diagnostic, product as part of what they do, some screening. So it's something, but it's not, it's not like the level of what Daphne is talking about. It's not 15 years to make some kind of new molecule. So those are the companies I worry about the most because I don't know who's funding them. Because the tech people are like, we don't like FDA. And then the biotech people are like, what is this? I'm used to seeing my drugs. Where are my drugs? So it's, I think those are the companies I think I worry about. And she maybe kind of sits, because of the perspective that she sees in the company that she's building now, I think she can see that perspective as well.
if it's a category creator, it's always issues up front, but it's like showing ROI, right? Like if you're an AI company and you're going through the FDA process, unfortunately, dealing with the FDA, FTC, it's complex. I mean, I've been in government, so I would just say, probably the biotech folks are, they're savvy and they understand that the president, party in power, and all the constituents that, they have to cater to has an impact on the direction and like the success of where these agencies have a point of view on these sort of approvals. But I think when you're talking about pure tech companies that are entering the space or going into like these tweener companies, they have to build that skill set in-house to be able to like go in and get those FDA approvals, show the ROI, have reimbursement at top of mind. The biotech industry has built that muscle over years and years of like research and savvy in the space. So I think it just may be time, hopefully, that'll solve this, and the companies that are actually showing ROI and understand this will succeed.
Okay, one last question for you guys. If Trump gets elected, I'm going to go there. Is it good or bad for biotech?
It's not about Trump versus not Trump. I think it's more about the FDA and FTC policies. The current FTC policies are... It stymies innovation because of all the impact on M&A. So I feel like that would be a positive change. But there's broader impact to the industry as a whole with Trump coming in, and I don't know where that's going to go. So I don't know.
Yeah, I actually agree with you. I think it's not so much Trump. It's more of which party is in and who's going to be appointing, and whether and when they're going to also be appointing people at the FTC and other branches that are responsible and key here. Another thing I would have to say is that biotech and pharma and digital health and hospital systems and healthcare as a whole, a lot of the constituents and lawmakers actually agree on the approach to really, as Ash said, to stifle some of the innovation. And so I think it's really and there are a lot of bipartisan bills that are both supported basically by both parties. So I think that we as an industry in the healthcare space just have to do a better job at showing the value proposition, because there's tremendous value here. Every single person we have on our podcast, I mean, they're truly innovating and helping patients, and hopefully we can get that message out.
I'm just too traumatized by the whole prospect that I've shut it down emotionally. But, I guess I think you're right. I think your ultimate point is right, that we do need to, as an industry, kind of talk a little bit more about what we're doing that's positive. And I've talked about this too. Also, be less afraid, when it comes to the incumbents. I thought one of the best things we heard from Daphne today was she mentioned the drug supply chain. And I think we just have to go there as an industry. Like we have been, for years now, trying to be the best friend to the system, and nobody's talking about how it really works. And I think we need to start allying with policymakers with the Hill and just say, look, we're trying to fix this thing. It's like pushing a boulder uphill. And, this whole system is filled with incumbents that do not have the right incentives, take the drug supply chain or anything else, the way that health plans work. We need to start explaining this, and showing examples of how innovators are getting crushed.
Yeah, I definitely want to do an episode on PBMs. Need some experts on this.
So much to say. So much to say. So little time.
Thanks for tuning in to Second Opinion. Share it with colleagues and friends, and message us to let us know what topics you want to discuss on the podcast. If you want to support the show, the best ways are to leave a review wherever you're listening, and make sure you are subscribed. And check out Chrissy's Substack, Second Opinion. A link to subscribe is in the episode description. Second Opinion is part of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Turpentine VC, Age of Miracles, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.
There's no shortage of podcasts and deep dives into the secrets of VC. But the truth is that the world's best venture firms and GPs at their helm still remain an enigma. VC is as much of an art as it is a science. Other shows focus on the now of venture, or even the last 10 years. But what separates the most enduring and generation-defining firms is the subject of a podcast called Turpentine VC from the Turpentine Podcast Network. On this season of the show, you'll hear from Ben Horowitz, Alfred Lin, Mahmoud Hamid, and more. Subscribe to Turpentine VC for the rare and revealing conversations that can only be had investor to investor.